This is a summary of Patrick Lecture 174, which is on self-esteem. And the 4 sections that I broke the lecture down into are becoming aware of self-rejection, the power of consciousness, changing attitudes leads to painless personality changes, and destructive habits and traits oppose life. Everybody has issues at some point or another with self-esteem. Becoming aware of how significantly and chronically you reject yourself is part of becoming aware of where you are. It doesn't condemn you to stay there. But as I use as an analogy, if you found yourself in a strange town and someone gave you a map, it wouldn't help until you established where you are. Once you establish where you are, then of course you'll want to know where you're going, and then you can begin your journey. But a map by itself, it has no value unless you know how you can use the map. So self-rejection is a way of taking ourselves out of the game. It declares it's not worth it, we're not worth it, which translates to it's not worth it, because it is the process of growth and development. And by rejecting ourselves, we're taking ourselves out of the game. One of the initial pieces of help that I got was from a sister organization practitioner. And they gave me what they called a 4-part Native American harmony, which turned out to be a 4-part Buddhist harmony, but I'm sure that there's belief in both systems that support this. And the 4-part harmony had 4 elements. One was show up. The second was pay attention to what has heart and meaning. The third was tell the truth without judgment or blame. And the 4th was stay open to the outcome instead of attached to it. Now, all of the ones except for the first part are 2 parts. And as I was in my recovery from life crisis, I could focus on showing up for a while, but that was it. That's the best I could do. All I could do was show up. Self-rejection means you don't show up. You take yourself out of whatever's going on because you're not worthy. If you don't show up, nothing else is possible. So one of the points of this lecture is to emphasize how destructive self-rejection is. Now, that does not mean you are perfect. I don't usually put my laundry out in front of everybody, but I am far from perfect. Perfection is not necessary. However, it is important that I know about these aspects in me that don't meet my ideals, that are not in perfect alignment with my values, that lead me astray because I have a value, but then I have I want. And I sometimes follow the I want instead of my value. It is important to know that I do that. And to know that I do that, I need to accept reality, which is I do it. That does not mean that is approval for what I'm doing. It's simply awareness and acceptance of what is. And we often get acceptance of what is confused with approval. But for instance, right now I'm in a room. I need to accept that. If I don't want to be in the room, then I need to take action. I need to move, change, walk, make arrangements. Something needs to be done. But just like the map, I need to accept for the moment, I'm in this room. And then figure out what to do about it. Self-rejection is like closing your eyes and saying, I'm not interested in seeing because I'm bad. So I shouldn't see. Seeing is a privilege. I don't have that privilege. But it kind of disconnects any work that you care to do when you disqualify yourself from doing the work. So the suggestion in the lecture is you need to look at your judgments. You need to look at how you beat yourself up. In the law of brotherhood, I have run into a very large number of people in spiritual work who say, I love other people, but I don't love myself. Well, that's breaking the law of brotherhood. In the law of brotherhood, you and I are inseparable. If I don't like you, then there's some aspect of my humanity that I don't like. And if I don't like me, there's some aspect of your humanity that I don't like. So the law of brotherhood means that I am part of the human race. And if I am trying to accept the situation of the human race, I need to accept my situation as it is in the moment with clear eyes. One of the examples that I found of this before I knew the words of pathwork to put it to, I think a lot of spiritual work happens when you're driving or you're commuting or in transit or trying to get through a pile of people or trying to get something done and being afraid you can't finish it. We tend to show a little bit of our underside during those moments. So I was driving and I started to change lanes and the car next to me honked. And I noticed, unfortunately, that my first reaction was to blame them. And then I immediately caught myself blaming them and then blamed myself. And my blame for myself was severe. It was brutal. It was worse than blaming the other guy. And for reasons unknown, what flitted through my head was, would you treat your daughter like that? And I thought, no, I wouldn't treat anybody like that. And that's when I realized that why am I treating myself like that? Is changing lanes without signaling, without looking, such a terrible thing that I should be brutally cruel to myself and make myself cringe about this error? Because when I'm cringing and hiding from this judgment, I'm not working on figuring out what I need to do to not do what I did. So becoming aware of self-rejection and accepting that the law of brotherhood asks that if you wish to love, you've got to be included in the love you have. That does, once again, does not mean you accept or you embrace people as they are. But at least you need to see them before anything else is possible. The second part of this was about the power of consciousness. And one of the lines that I used to illustrate this comes from Pathwork Lecture 150, which is actually the next month's topic, November 2019, which is self-liking as a condition for the state of bliss, which is obviously a counterpoint to this lecture. And the quote is, for the guide is suggesting that you say this phrase, and that is, I want to look at the truth in myself. And the guide makes a promise that amazing things will happen if you say this to yourself every single day. Something as simple as, I want to look at the truth in myself. Now, you cannot be 100% wanting to. You can be 90%. It'll get you started. But not for the purpose of judgment and self-defeat and self-rejection. Just tell me what's going on. Tell me the truth. Let me see. The guide says that if you do this, you will also need to do three things. You will need to perceive and experience life differently. You have habits of consciousness, where you see and experience things through a lens. You're going to need to take the lens off, the lens of judgment, the lens of, I need to earn my way or I'll be rejected. You need to take these lenses off and to perceive and experience the world differently. Secondly, you need to recognize the power of thought and will. To be able to feel, express, and decide is a great power. I speak many times of how we don't realize some of the most glorious parts of life, and that is we can act. We can do things. We may not do things. We may choose not to do things. But that does not mean that we can't do them. It means we're choosing not to do them. And choice is part of the power of consciousness. Now, just because you don't use that choice well, doesn't mean you don't have the choice. Doesn't mean you don't have the power. The guide is suggesting that you recognize the power of being able to make decisions and live your life differently. And thirdly, he says there's a privilege to being conscious, of being able to feel, express, and decide. It sounds like the same thing, but one is to recognize it. And that is the second is to honor it, to see it as a privilege. He also talks about hopelessness and stasis. And when we hold on to hopelessness, we're trying to achieve stasis. If I hold on and I'm hopeless, nothing will happen. But the world goes on. Life goes on. The day moves into evening and into the next day. So while we're hiding and saying life is hopeless, life is still moving. And our life is still moving. Our body is still doing what it's supposed to do. Our job and experience and opportunities are still moving on, and we will miss them if we hold ourselves out. So one way of holding out is self-rejection. And another way of holding out is trying to be hopeless. As if you could say, I'm perfectly still so nothing will happen. It isn't going to affect the rest of the world. But it will affect your ability to feel, think, interact, decide, and choose. So holding on to hopelessness is a way of, it's related to self-rejection. It's a belief system. I will not do anything because if I do something, it will be wrong. One of the, I tend to repeat similar things. That's what I do. Because some concepts are so wonderful that I just find them useful over and over again. And there was a section of the lectures where the guide spoke of inanimate objects. And I don't think the guide made too much of it, but I did in my imagination. I suddenly wondered what it would be like to be an inanimate object and watch the world pass by and not be able to do anything about it. So when the guide says that every atom, every molecule has consciousness, then the computer, the microphone, the container of water, the piece of paper, they all have consciousness, but they can't act on it. And I use this as an example about how much of a privilege it is to be a human being and not a dog or a cat or a lamp. And the invitation is to use the power. Will you use it perfectly? No, you will not. But if you don't start using it and you don't start practicing, you'll never become expert at using the power. And the skill and facility does come faster than you realize. When you were a child and you tried to walk, far before you were conscious of learning things, your intuition, your instinct to walk made you try over and over again. You weren't counting the number of times you fell down. You weren't derogating yourself for not being able to walk. You were simply driven to walk. And most of us are able to accomplish that. If today you had to face a task as daunting as learning to walk, you might give up because it's going to take a long time to coordinate muscles, to get all the nerve endings, to get the brain wired and controlled, to get the coordination, the balance, so that you're not walking, well, you're walking like this, as lumpy as it might be, is still walking. And as you walk, you get better. And most of us don't walk like toddlers. So we've learned something. So that's all about the power of consciousness. The next section was about changing attitudes results in painless personality changes. Someone taught me one time that the only thing you absolutely control spiritually, on this planet, perhaps in the universe, is your attitude. Everything else can change, but you do control your attitude about what is happening, about the threat that you perceive, about your experience. You can have an attitude about your experience with another person has a completely different attitude about the same experience. So when you change your attitude, in effect, you change reality. Because most of the reality, we're not looking at facts and figures. We're looking at interpretations. So when I look at reality, I'm looking at an interpretation of reality. I see this and I have a positive attitude towards it, so I can fix it. I see that, I have a negative attitude, I don't want to touch it, I'm going to put it away. The things may be identical, but my attitude is different. And therefore my actions are different and the results are different. So in changing attitudes, you can change aspects of your personality. Another aspect that came up in the group meetings is something that I share. I resent the idea of somebody telling me I should change my personality. It's a wounding for me. This is not about changing who you really are. And the analogy I use, metaphor that I use, can't tell the difference between those two words sometimes. One's longer than the other. But the analogy I use is that personality is like the clothing we wear. And some of us run around in the world with a lot of clothing on. We run around with multiple layers of clothing and 3 winter coats on. We need to defend ourselves. We need to be ready for all things. We want everything at our disposal and we don't want to let anything go. This is a burden. We have to carry around all this stuff. And it insulates us from touch and feeling. It insulates us to some extent from the world. That's what our personality can be like. When we're carrying around defenses and fears and attitudes that don't serve us, it's like wearing your whole wardrobe at once. Instead of relaxing and saying, I will pick and choose based on what I need for today. And my wardrobe will change over the seasons as appropriate. The common languaging teaches us the personality is us. Pathwork teaches that the personality is the result of the real self and the false beliefs, misconceptions, and distortions that we carry into this life. As we dissolve and find the truth of these false beliefs, misconceptions, and distortions, we can let go of some of these defensive maneuvers that were generated by the false belief and become more relaxed and comfortable being ourselves. Now, you don't have to be a nudist. You don't have to walk around without any clothes. It's probably not realistic for the majority of us. Nice to know that you could and that the clothes aren't glued to you. So if you think about personality as being how you present yourself and what makes you comfortable and what you've gathered around you to help you be in the world the way you choose to be, then you can see that changing your personality is not about changing your real self, but changing how you express how you are. Another way to look at this, and I apologize for banal examples, but I find them useful instead of talking about abstract spiritual concepts. When I put on clothing that does not suit me, I do not feel comfortable. I don't feel like myself. Every time I move, it just doesn't feel right. I don't feel that I can reach out the way I want to. Even sitting, I just feel like I'm holding something that's not me. So that we have put on these aspects of ourselves throughout our life for various reasons, without necessarily thinking what it means, and perhaps not thinking about the ramifications. And some of this stuff can come off. There's a day where you say, I'm not doing this any longer. I will spend some time investigating and exploring and finding out what suits me as I am today. So this is all around changing attitudes, can create painless personality changes because there's a deeper advocate Advocate's the wrong word. There's a deeper purpose. We are beginning to access our real selves and to honor it, and the old clothes don't work anymore. And this will create chain reactions. So changing your attitude will create a chain reaction of situations. Another thing that people worry about in spiritual work is they feel like they're hanging on by a thread, and they only have a certain number of people they can speak to. And if they start studying this work, they won't be able to speak about it to those people. They'll lose their friends. That may be true. It also may be true that you need new friends. So two things, again, are possible here. One is that you need new friends you've actually outgrown. This group of colleagues, this group of comrades. But secondly, when you change, when you become more of who you are, you offer them the opportunity to be with you in a different way. They may actually want to be with you in a different way. So there's a concept in pathwork called collusion. And collusion is where I'm going to do this and I want you to do it too, so that we won't challenge each other. So if I if I lie, cheat, and steal, then I want to be around other people who lie, cheat, and steal because I don't want to be attacked for my decisions. And then you want the same thing. So we're colluding, we're conspiring to make what we're doing okay. Imagine one day one of the group of liars, cheaters, and stealers wakes up and says, I don't want to do this anymore. It would be natural that the group would reject them. They'd throw them out because you're not playing the game anymore. And we still want to play the game. But what if you're not the only one? What if there are others who have realized that this isn't really the life they want to lead? That it's not as much fun to live as an outlaw as it is to integrate yourself into society and work by common principles. Some people are more able to take an outward step than others. It's an aspect of leadership to stand up and say, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do something else. And look around and see if anybody might like to join you. If not completely, because not everybody moves in lockstep, then it might help them at a later point in their life when they are ready to make that decision. So another way of saying this is, if you won't do it for you, do it for them. If you don't think you should be leading your own life, consider what message that gives other people. And this especially comes in parenting. When a parent doesn't live their own life according to their own value system, but accepts the value systems of others, then that's what children see as a role model. Now, last month, we looked at visualization as a process to reach the unitive state. And in that lecture, we talked about the role of role models, needing role models, and then eventually becoming your own role model. We are role models to our colleagues, to our friends, to our family, to our children, and to society at large. At some point, just like the fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, one person needs to have the courage to say, it's not true. I can't see it. It's not true for me. And accept that it may continue to be true for other people, but that they're not the only one. And in that story, the giveaway was that when the little boy pointed at the emperor, who was thinking he was wearing invisible clothes of gold, when he said, the emperor has no clothes, people fell out of their illusion and started to laugh because they'd made themselves see things a certain way. And when the child pointed and said the truth, it was so obviously the truth. The reason that story has staying power is because it's a universal truth. The question is, are you willing to be the first one to say, I don't get it. I don't see it. I don't want to be here. There's something wrong. Now, I will admit in my life, I have not been willing to say that. I have said it internally, but I have been terrified of saying it out loud. And it took a long time for me to get the courage. But once I did, I found that to be true. I wasn't the only one. It's not that everyone shares my precise view, but there were doubts that others had, and they are more spoken about when the first person stands up. Let me give you a silly example. When doing workshops, sometimes we would be doing process work, and we would hit a really powerful dynamic insight, point of insight for the person. And then almost in the next breath, somebody said, I have to go to the bathroom. And then 5 or 6 other people would say, I have to go to the bathroom. And the hall empties, the room empties. And I admit that as a novice, my first thought was, what have I done wrong? They've all left. They all ran away. So I went to my supervisor. And she said, no, you didn't do anything wrong. That there's a physiological reaction when you get something that you release. And in that physiological, energetic, which we're so many layers, it's hard to tell the difference. The kidney releases, or however, whatever the mechanism is, it releases liquid, goes to your bladder, you have to go to the bathroom. So she said, consider that as a sign that something happened. Now, you don't have to say something good happened. You don't have to say it was excellent. You don't have to say it was perfect. The idea was that something happened. There was a release. Then I started making that presumption. And I began noticing that when we hit a point of deep insight for the person who was doing process work, and we paused, everybody had to go. And instead of interpreting that as they're running away from me, which was narcissistic and egocentric, but that's what I did. Instead of saying they're running away from me, I said, I guess there's a release. It became a signal to me. And it happens to individuals, but it's just not as dramatic, and we can't necessarily associate it with individuals. But we can associate it when half the room gets up and says, gotta go. So that's another way of trying to understand how changing our attitudes can have a chain reaction, can have physiological reactions. It can have chain reactions that work in terms of cause and effect in our lives, and it can change our personality. The last section was about how destructive habits and traits oppose life. And the hardest part about trying to get your hands on self-esteem is that we all have some ugliness in us. I have ugliness. I have resentments and fears. Trying to keep this generic. I know where I am a coward. It doesn't matter how I look to other people. I live in me, and I know moments of cowardice. I know places where I duck, and I'm afraid to say what I feel and think. I'm afraid of rejection, even if it's temporary. Where I don't want to be seen, I don't want to be pointed at, I want to hide. I'm going to call these places ugly. They certainly don't reflect who I am at my best. They certainly don't help the work that I do. They don't help the people around me. They don't help anybody. So that there are some ugly places in me that I'm still working on. The guide says that peace is seeing and accepting the ugliest in you and not losing sight of your intrinsic beauty, even if that beauty is not fully manifested yet. And this is where this work is spiritual. It's not a fact-finding mission. It's not a personnel evaluation where you're going through a checklist and it's pass-fail. This is about the rest of your life. This is about spiritual development. That doesn't necessarily stop with human life. This is just an example of who we are in spirit. So that if you can hold on to the idea that you are a divine being, and that by simply showing up on this planet, you have made a positive statement about wanting to learn, wanting to develop, wanting to do better. And part of that doing better is to look through the toy chest and find out what doesn't belong there, what needs to be fixed or mended, what needs to be thrown out. So that's where destructive traits oppose life, and peace is seeing and accepting the ugliest in you and not losing sight of your intrinsic beauty. And this is why relationships, intimate relationships, whether they be friends, even colleagues, or professional or personal romantic, it is very powerful to find another human being who sees the best in you and is not revolted by the fact that that's not all you are, but who continues to see the potential and the best in you and supports you in activating and growing and enlarging that part of you while not being massively affected moment by moment by your weaknesses